from the sanitation, the medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system and public health, what have the Romans ever done for us?
Well, I can tell you what they did for Britain. This is the interior of a drinking house in Pompeii. Places like these were called tabernae, and when the Romans invaded Britain in AD 43, they brought with them many of the trappings of the Roman world, including these tabernae. They quickly adapted to providing the locals with their local brew, which was called ale, and the word eventually evolved to tavern. These taverns not only survived, but continued to adapt to an ever-changing clientele. Much of the brewing was done on religious premises, priories, monasteries, abbeys, and these were the establishments where travellers could find rest and shelter on their journeys. Thus a tradition of hospitality began. Many of the pubs claiming a long history are still on what were the sites of these religious houses. Others, like the Trip to Jerusalem in Nottingham, were originally brewhouses providing beer for the local lord of the manor. The Trip is actually built into the caves under the rock on which Nottingham Castle stands. In Roman times, wooden poles hung with ivy or vine leaves were placed outside the drinking houses to show they were open and serving. The tradition continued after the Romans left, and in medieval times a horizontal ale stake would be hung with an ivy garland or a bush at the end to indicate fresh beer was ready for sale. In 1393, King Richard II compelled landlords to erect signs outside their premises. The legislation stated, "Whosoever shall brew ale in the town with intention of selling it must hang out a sign, otherwise he will forfeit his ale." This law was to make alehouses easily visible to passing inspectors, ale tasters and tax collectors. William Shakespeare's father John was one such inspector. So from this time, painted boards started to be used. Picture signs were important when many people were illiterate. A crown, a bull's head or a star were easy symbols to paint and to recognise. As the White Hart was King Richard's heraldic badge, it became a popular, if slightly grovelly, way of complying with the new law to use this emblem as a sign of the tavern. For this reason, there are still many pubs around the country with this name. Here are two of them. In the early 1500s, when Henry VIII split England away from the Catholic Church and established himself as monarch as head of the Church of England, pub names stopped favouring religious symbols such as the Pope's head and began featuring images of royal figures, hence many pubs called the King's Head. The Red Lion emblem is often attributed to the 14th century Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, but it was also the heraldic emblem of Scotland, and in 1603 James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, became James I of England. Although he never returned to Scotland after coming down to London, he allegedly demanded that all public buildings display the Red Lion to show allegiance to him, and public buildings included taverns and pubs. By this time, it is estimated that there were some 17,000 alehouses and 2,000 inns throughout England. And the Red Lion was the most common pub name and still is. There are well over 500 in this country at this time. This one is at the bottom of Whitehall, just opposite the Houses of Parliament, and is often frequented by members of Parliament and political commentators. Tour of English history. In 1651, Oliver Cromwell defeated Prince Charles, son of the beheaded king, at the Battle of Worcester, and the prince fled the battle, becoming a fugitive. Legend has it that to evade Cromwell's troops while on the run, the prince dressed as a woman, hid in various houses and climbed an English oak tree at the Boscobel house in Shropshire, where he concealed himself. The prince then slipped away to France before eventually returning to England to become Charles II, King of England, Scotland and Ireland. The tree became known as the Royal Oak and the history was celebrated through its use as a pub name. There are 344 pubs in this country, known as the Royal Oak. The story behind the Crown's rise to pub name stardom is not as exciting as the Royal Oak, but it's much more pragmatic. As monarchs waxed and waned and various kings and queens were either dethroned or beheaded, having the generic name the Crown or the Crown Inn lent pub owners the appearance of supporting whoever reigned at the time, while also preventing them from having to change the name with each new ruler. It was also a very simple symbol to remember, even in a time when people couldn't read or write. There are 328 pubs called the Crown. Another common name for a pub is the Marquis of Granby. These pubs were named after John Manners, the Marquis of Granby, who was the son of the 3rd Duke of Rutland, and he was a general in the 18th century army in Britain. He showed great concern for the welfare of his men, and on their retirement he would give them funds for many of them to establish taverns, which were all subsequently named after him. Some names for pubs that seem so absurd or whimsical have come from corruptions of old slogans, such as the Bag o' Nails, which comes from bacchanals, which were the followers of Bacchus, the god of wine. Some old pubs had pictures of the devil dancing with bacchanalians, and it was from this that Bag o' Nails eventually was corrupted. The origin of the pub name The Goat and Compasses supposes that the name originates from the corruption of the Puritan phrase, God encompasseth. It is unlikely that a God-fearing Puritan would have corrupted such a phrase, and it's much more likely that it was a joke at their expense. The town of Stalybridge in Greater Manchester is thought to have the pub with the longest name in the United Kingdom. It's the Old 13th Cheshire Astley Volunteer Rifleman Corps Inn. And by the look of the building in the photograph here, it looks as though they had to build an extension onto one side in order to encompass the whole of this phrase. The Signal Box, an inn at Cleethorpes in Lincolnshire, claims to be the smallest pub in the world, measuring only 8 foot by 8 foot. It only has room for a counter and 4 bar stools, but there is a beer garden providing extra space for customers. And now the big question. Which is England's oldest pub? This is a highly disputed and argued question, with many pubs putting a claim for this title forward. Today I'll just run through some of the front runners. We'll start though with a clear winner in a subcategory. First established in Wapping in 1520, the Prospect of Whitby pub comfortably takes the title of the country's oldest riverside pub. In its heyday it served scholars such as Dickens and Samuel Pepys. It was a meeting place for sailors, smugglers, cutthroats and footpads. In the 17th century it became the hostelry of choice of hanging Judge Jeffreys, the scourge of the Monmouth Rebellion. He lived nearby, and a replica gallows and noose hangs by the Thameside window commemorating his custom. According to the historian John Stowe, it was the usual place for the hanging of pirates and sea rovers at the low water mark, and they had to remain there until 3 tides had overflowed them. In the 18th century, the first fuchsia plant in the United Kingdom was sold at the pub. And now, on to the main category. This is the Bingley Arms near Leeds in Yorkshire, which claims to have been offering weary travellers and clergymen alike a refreshing drink since 953 AD and is said to have been mentioned in the Domesday Book. After the Reformation, Catholic priests on the run from King Henry and his men would be found hiding in the holes in the pub's chimneys. So for some while it was called the Priest's Inn. They say it has a known history that dates back to 953, when a man called Samson Ellis brewed in the central part of the building. The inn was a popular resting spot for travelling monks, and it's located on what used to be a main route between Kirkstall Abbey and the Abbey at St Mary's in York. The Porch House in Stow-on-the-Wold in the Cotswolds also claims it's the oldest inn in England. They say it has evidence that a tavern with rooms existed here in 947 AD, and that parts of the building were once a hospice built by the order of the Duke of Cornwall in that year. In the 1970s, when the pub was receiving renovations, some of the building's timbers were dated to over 1,000 years old, which backs up the story. Another alehouse with a strong claim to this title is the Royal Standard of England in Beaconsfield. The first evidence historians can find of this place is listed in the Domesday Book, dating back to 1086, at the time of the Norman Conquest. Ye Old Man and Scythe in Bolton has one of the bloodiest pasts of any pub. James Stanley, the 7th Earl of Derby, was executed outside the premises in 1651 during the Civil War. He is said to haunt the pub today. However, according to the Guinness Book of Records, Ye Old Fighting Cocks in St Albans, which dates back to the 8th century, is the oldest pub in the country. Its foundations incorporate part of the Palace of Offa, King of the Mercians, and dating from around 793. The pub you can see today was built in the 11th century on these early Saxon ecclesiastical foundations, very near to St Albans Abbey. It moved to its present site after the dissolution of the abbey in 1539, but it is reputed that there are tunnels stretching from the beer cellar to the abbey, apparently frequented by the monks in those days. Cockfighting was a national pastime in England for some 600 years, from the reign of Henry II up until it was banned in 1849. It is thought that the cockpit, about 8 foot wide and 10 foot long, was brought down to the pub from the abbey when the original name of the pub, which was the Roundhouse, was changed to Ye Old Fighting Cock. After the sport was banned, they changed its name again to the Fisherman, but in 1872 they named it again Ye Old Fighting Cocks. This is a really fascinating subject, and there are many, many more tales to tell. But I think it's time to move on. Who knows where? Well, thank you for joining me. Bye for now.